Just to note, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SCVO website and our YouTube channel afterwards. This webinar is part of the support and guidance SCVO's Trustees Network provides for members of boards and committees across Scotland. Through the network, you can find information and news on relevant topics and a regular e-bulletin and webinars, and e-learning modules and SCVO's Good Governance Checkup. My name is Susan Smith and I'm SCVO's Campaigns Manager, and I'm leading on a new piece of work to support voluntary organisations to take more action in the face of the climate change threat. I'm delighted that we have with us today Julie Hutchison from Aberdeen Standard Capital, who is the sponsor of the Trustees Network. We also have Fraser Miller, who's an environmental analyst from Zero Waste Scotland, which provides advice and support to people and organisations to embrace the circular economy. And Julie Christie from the Environmental Funders Network, who I'm sure you're all desperate to hear from. We're all here today because charities and voluntary organisations exist to create a better world. And as we look ahead to COP26 and the big climate conference in November, there's no better time for trustees to consider their organisation's environmental responsibilities. Scotland has a legally binding target to become a net zero country by 2045, which is just over 20 years away. So we've got a lot to do. SCVO knows that voluntary organisations are still very focused on COVID and how to support the communities that they serve through this really challenging time. However, we also recognise that we can't keep ignoring the climate crisis, which is set to be the next big challenge that we all have to face. That's why we've launched a survey and we're asking organisations to fill it in to tell us what they're doing in this area and what support they need. One of my colleagues will share a link to that in the chat just now. So please take a look and forward it on to any of the relevant people in your organisation. This webinar and some of the others we've got coming up will help us to find out what your organisation's needs are in this area. So please also post in the chat your thoughts on the issue. This particular webinar is focusing on why trustees should look strategically at climate change and share some practical pointers on how to get started. Our speakers are going to talk to us for a few minutes each on their area of speciality, and we'll also have time for some questions at the end. If you want to submit a question, you can do so anytime. Please just use the Q&A function in your webinar dashboard. And also please upvote any questions you would like to have answered, as we'll probably not get through all of them. First off, we're going to kick off with a quick poll, and please just go ahead and answer the question. Climate-related issues have already been on the agenda at one of our charity board meetings. I can usually see how people are answering, but I can't just now. So I'll just wait and tell you what everybody has to say at the end. And the results are 30% of you say, yes, you have discussed it at a board meeting already, and 70% of you say you haven't. So I think that will be a bit of fodder for our speakers. First up, we've got Julie Hutchison from Aberdeen Standard Capital, and she's going to talk about finance and investments for you. Julie.
Thanks, Susan, and hello everyone. Hope you're having a good day. I've had my cardigan off this afternoon because it's either been beautiful sunshine or hail. So yeah, I'm very, very confused about things today. Let me see if I can get my share screen to work. And here we go. So this idea of being a climate confident trustee kind of occurred to me really. In some ways, looking at the way that trustees are recruited, you sometimes see now the description of a charity that's looking for a digital trustee or something of that nature. And I think this idea of having a climate confident trustee is something that is worth considering, and perhaps it's something that we should all aspire to be, rather than it being just the job of one individual on the board. But from an Aberdeen Standard point of view, thinking about the expertise we bring looking at finance and investments, I've got a few comments to offer as a backdrop to this theme today. And it really focuses on the guide that Oscar has on its website, the Charity Investments Guidance and Good Practice. And what you have in here for those charities that do have investments, it sets out the basis on which charities can validly consider screening out certain sectors should they wish to, or indeed tilting their investments to favour certain things. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But in this whole field of environment and climate considerations, a first place to look is, in a sense, reading from the back, because there are two case studies in particular that are worth looking at in the Oscar guidance. Case study number 3 looks at a charity which has around about £150,000 and looks at a small investment that it's making in the field of community renewals. So that's one example that ties into the kind of things that we're talking about today. Case study number 4 in the Oscar guidance on investments looks at the situation of an education charity which has an endowment, and where they are looking at both excluding fossil fuel investments, which typically is taken to mean oil and gas companies, and actively seeking to invest in positive investments in low carbon and renewables. So there's a range of different approaches out there. It's not a question of thinking that there is just one way to consider reflecting climate change or environmental concerns in your portfolio. So thinking about what this might mean in practice, I've got a bit of a summary as an ABC. And it's true to say that some charities deploy one or more, or indeed all 3 of these types of approaches. And of course, where you find the detail on this is in a charity's investment policy statement. And we've got a guide on investment policy statements that you can download from our website. Now, where this starts in terms of where some charities look at when it comes to the climate change issue, some of them take the view that they want to quite simply avoid harm. They do not wish to invest in what they see as some of the key companies contributing to this problem. And so the screening approach, the exclusions approach, is where they favour. What that typically tends to involve, whether it's called fossil fuel companies, it can, on the one hand, exclude coal and tar sands. They're seen as the most environmentally damaging of some of the energy sources in some eyes, or it can be a more general one, which also extends to oil and gas extraction. So there's a whole range of different types of exclusions that can apply. And again, the choices that you might have may differ between investment firms. So that's where some charities seek to focus. It's about not having their investment portfolio invested in a way that either contradicts their purposes or causes reputational concern. Those 2 key points, again, back to the Oscar guidance, that's the kind of basis on which decision-making tends to rest when charities are thinking about why would they seek to exclude one or more sectors. Either it's a reputational concern or it's not in line with your charity's purposes. Now, the second place that charities often look to address climate change and environmental concerns in their investments is by buying better companies. So they look to amplify the bit of the investment world which is to do with being an active shareholder. So when you own shares, you have the right to vote at AGMs, there will be resolutions, there's the opportunity to have your voice heard in that way. Now, there's a range of views on how effective that is or is not, but the point being that there is a degree of coordination that can take place, and indeed many investors seek to act in coalition with other investors to build a larger voice and a larger block of shares seeking to vote in a certain way at AGMs. So that engagement piece, that being an active shareholder, is important. And the other aspect of engagement really is the companies you're investing in. Your investment manager is on your behalf seeking to encourage the energy companies or others to drive better performance in this area, to seek to have a plan, a strategy that will see them thrive in a lower carbon world. And of course, that extends beyond just energy companies, but into things like concrete and other carbon intensive industries. Integrating ESG, I'm not going to say too much about today. It's a very detailed subject and I've just got a short period of time, but that's really to do with the research on environmental, social, and governance factors that go into how your investment manager researches suitable companies for your investment portfolio. And there's increasingly now a focus on making that business as usual and integrating that sort of research into how investments are selected for your portfolio. So that's 2 of the options: avoiding harm and buying better companies. And certainly over the last 18 months, the shift in the focus I've seen is towards this third one about contributing to the solutions. So this involves actively choosing an investment approach where the capital is being allocated to solutions and matters that are focused on the transition to a lower carbon economy. So companies that are providing solutions to climate change concerns, those that are more efficient users of water, that are involved in circular economy matters, those that measure their impact, their environmental output, and so on. So there are a range of things that companies can do that mean they will be, in theory, better placed in a lower carbon society, and therefore within consideration for this type of investment approach. Now, as I say, I've seen charities adopt this kind of approach more in the last 18 months. Originally, it was more about excluding certain investments, and there's certainly many charities still favouring that approach. But wherever it is you rest on this sort of question, there's certainly a range of ways that you can go about this. Now, we recently were involved in a sort of poll looking at how this is being considered by charities. 70% of the charities we asked had not yet considered climate questions in connection with their investments. 20% had already excluded oil and gas companies, and 13% had chosen to stay invested, favouring that buyer better companies middle section that I mentioned earlier, being an active shareholder and wanting to try and support change through influencing companies. Now, of course, it's not just about looking at these things in isolation. And often when I'm working with charity boards and looking at these policy considerations, it's about a more holistic question about how does this fit into your broader strategy as a charity? And if there's something I have a slight beam about, it's that charities use the word sustainability very often to mean their future financial viability and that alone, rather than looking at this in a context that's more driven by environmental or future livability of planet type matters. So my challenge is always, are you looking at this question too narrowly? What across your policy framework in your charity might need to be revisited if you're going to start looking at this whole area of climate more generally within your organisation? How does it fit into your charity's wider strategy? It's not just a question of your investment portfolio, it's a question perhaps more generally about your operating practices and so on. And it links back, of course, to your charitable purposes, the impact on your beneficiaries, the impact on staff, trustees, other volunteers. So it's certainly the case that once you start thinking about what all the possible areas are of impact in your charity, this can become something really that comes into every part of your organisation, and it's not just a narrowly defined financial question. Now, to signpost other resources, Susan's mentioned the survey that SCVO are doing at the moment. There is a blog on the website that looks at some of these questions and shares some of the research that's been done so far on this area. And just to signpost one or two other areas for you before I hand back to Susan. The next webinar we have is on the 2nd of June, looking at lifting the lid on charity structures. We're going to be looking at SCVOs and trusts and all sorts of different other underlying legal structures as a bit of a demystifier. So for any trustees watching who are needing a refresher on that, do join us for that one. And we also have a recording of the recent one looking at demystifying charity accounts. So that's also available on our website. If you have any questions, do pop them in the Q&A function on Zoom. Be delighted to circle back round to them later on. I think the plan is to take questions at the end. And if you've anything that occurs to you after today on this question, do get in touch. It's a big topic. It's one that I can only hint at in the space of 10 minutes, but hopefully the ABC approach of avoiding buying better companies and looking at contributing to solutions gives you at least an overview of the types of approaches which you can choose, of course, to get into much greater detail on another day. So that's all from me, and I will now hand back to Susan.
Thanks very much, Julie. That was really interesting. It really is a big, big topic, and it's something that, as you say, once you start looking at, and once SCVO started looking at it, we realised that it really does impact on everything that you do as an organisation. And I'm sure that Julie and Fraser will back us up and give you a bit more detail on that as we go ahead. We've now got a second poll, which is climate-related issues already appear on our charity's risk register. And the answers are yes, no, or don't know. Perhaps you don't remember whether it's on your risk register. It will be interesting to hear. And the results are 46% of you say no, 21% of you say yes, which is good, and 33 don't know. I think it's great that 21% are saying yes, it already does exist on your risk register. But both of these polls, I think, back up this sort of early work that SCVO's finding on this, which is that a lot of organisations haven't really started on this journey. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this webinar and the next few that we're having on this topic. So up now we've got Fraser Miller from Zero Waste Scotland, who really is the expert on this subject, and he'll have lots of information for you about why you should start engaging and how to do it.
Hi Susan, thanks very much. I don't want to disappoint you saying an absolute expert in this, then set me up for a fall right away, but I'll do my best. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about the Zero Waste Scotland Net Zero plan, essentially because we've developed it in such a way that it can be used by any organisation or, you know, in third sector to sort of pursue their own route to net zero. So I've just got a couple of slides and I will attempt to share those with you now. Just to confirm, can everyone see my slides, but they can't see my speaker's notes?
That's right, Fraser.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thanks very much for having me along today. My name is Fraser Miller. I am an environmental analyst at Zero Waste Scotland, but I'm also our net zero carbon plan lead. It was myself and one other that developed our own net zero plan, and that was just a little over a year ago. So since then, I've spent a lot of time engaging with all, you know, public, private, and third sectors about net zero in general, really, and about how organisations can pursue their own route to net zero. So yeah, I mean, we published our plan about a year ago. There's been a lot of changes in the landscape since then. Obviously, we didn't anticipate back then we'd all be working from home. But I did want to talk about the plan, our own net zero plan, and how it can be applied across all sectors. Specifically because even though we have undergone such a fundamental change in the way we work, and going forward we're going to continue working from home to a large degree, certainly Zero Waste Scotland are, our plan is adaptable, and the 5 principles that underpin it they can resonate regardless of what your working situation is. So I'm just going to go through it very quickly, conscious that I don't have a great deal of time. But first off, it's just important to sort of emphasise the point why we should all care about net zero. And as has been said already, Scotland has committed to being a net zero nation by 2045. Now that is a world leading ambition. No other nation has made the same commitment. The UK is obviously aiming for 2050, so we're kind of going to have to show them how to do it. But this means that sectors that make up the Scottish economy all need to feed into this larger vision, and that means developing their own net zero plan. So because it's a new concept, there are a lot of benefits to be gained by showing leadership early on, forging ahead, and you know, building a reputation as being a leader in this area. There's a lot of business advantages. It's good for securing new contacts, customers, but also it can attract new talent to an organisation. So, you know, more people want to come and work with a particular company or business, or, you know, a third sector organisation. So what does net zero mean? So again, just quickly, net zero, the essence of net zero is reducing our emissions down to the minimum through positive internal interventions. So basically dealing with as much as you can in-house. But it also means for everything that you can't deal with in-house, you're talking about outsourcing, and generally at the moment that means talking about offsetting. And this is kind of the essence of net zero. We reduce carbon as much as we can, and then we have to offset. In an ideal world, we wouldn't even need the term net zero, we wouldn't need the term offset, but yeah, we're not there. We kind of do need these terms, and this is how we are pursuing net zero, at least just now. I mean, who knows what the future might hold. So yeah, what we want to focus on just now is driving down our emissions as far as we can, and then for everything else, we offset. But we really try and limit the use of offsets if we're talking about net zero, because offset is not the answer to net zero, not at all. And on the slide there, we can see what I would regard as a really, really weak net zero plan, because you've got a lot of emissions, therefore you've got a lot of offsets. But what we can do is, on the left, if we intervene and we have ways of reducing our carbon through, different mitigation measures, then we reduce a little bit more, then we start to really see some big carbon savings, and our reliance on offsetting is also, largely curtailed. So our 5 principles, as I say, they were developed with businesses of any nature in mind. They are the Zero Waste Scotland principles, but they can be applied universally, or almost universally. But it's important to say that finance is obviously an important consideration for organisations, but net zero also has to benefit the planet as well as being cost effective. So I suppose with that in mind, our plan was developed following our 5 key principles that can, as I say, be replicated by anyone. And I'll just give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of these right now. So number 1, this one, it's very important to understand where your emissions hotspots lie. You need to know where your biggest emitters are. So for Zero Waste Scotland, we knew that our commuting impacts and our corporate travel impacts were our largest by some distance, no pun intended. So you need to measure your carbon. So to do that, you go through a 4-step process. And that is, you need to establish where your hotspots are, and that's through measuring. Then you need to design interventions based on where your hotspots are. So we knew we took a lot of flights, so we implemented a flight cap. We also sort of banned travel by flying within the UK and much of mainland Europe. And those were targeted interventions, basically, because we knew we had to tackle the problem we had with taking too many flights. And then number 3, we monitor these to make sure that the interventions are having the intended effect. And if they are, then fantastic, we can keep them. If not, then we go back to the drawing board, we tweak them, or we just implement new ones. And then after all that, what we do is we just repeat the process, because 2045, as Susan says, it's over 20 years away. So there's a lot of time in there to get our carbon down as far as we possibly can. So we're talking about using this as a cycle that might go through a few different iterations. You might have 3 or 4 interventions that you try within the time span, and maybe even many more than that. So that's number 1. Number 2, we're talking about taking responsibility for our entire carbon footprint. And I'd say this is very, very relevant at the moment, because when organisations are starting out on their net zero journey, they tend to consider the 2 smaller circles on that slide. So that's your scope 1 and scope 2. So that's energy use, if you own any vehicles. But what some organisations tend to do is they treat the bigger circle there as more of a future focus. And that's because it's much harder to measure the areas on the 3rd circle there, specifically things around commuting. Like, how do you get a handle on your commuting impacts, or supply chain emissions? I mean, that is a ridiculously difficult web to try and unweave, and things like that. So because they're more difficult, organisations tend to focus on what's slightly easier, which is scope 1 and scope 2. But this is basically what my job is, and that's helping organisations try and tackle the bigger circle there, because Zero Waste Scotland have mechanisms in place to try and, well, they've already been shown that they have some success in measuring supply chain emissions, commuting emissions, and basically we're trying to go after all the unknowns within the larger circle. Because if you want to have a good net zero plan that really tackles the root of your carbon footprint, then you can't constrain it to just scope 1 and 2. Ideally, you want to have something in place for as much of it as possible. That's not always going to be possible in the short term, because some of these metrics that we're developing might take a bit of time, and some, like getting a handle on supply chain emissions, as I say, is very, very tough. But it's certainly something that a good net zero plan will commit to doing, at least at a later date if it's not possible right now. So number 3, we're talking about achieving absolute emissions reductions. So this one is just really short. It basically means, regardless of the size of your business, you have to be able to decarbonise at a faster rate. So if a business or a 3rd sector was to talk about decarbonising in per capita terms, but they're growing as a business faster than they can decarbonise, then yes, the per capita emissions might go down, but they'll have more people on the payroll, and so their overall carbon emissions will actually go up. So it's very important, if you have a meaningful net zero plan, to ensure that you talk about making absolute emissions reductions rather than talking about per capita emissions reductions, so that, you know, it doesn't matter how big your business gets, you're still going to be reducing carbon and getting yourselves closer and closer to net zero, as opposed to further and further away. And I did touch on this briefly. This is about offsetting, which some people treat as a bit of a dirty word. It's a sort of necessary evil with net zero where we are at the moment. Offsetting is cheap. It's an easy way to get to net zero, but it's effectively, you're paying someone else to carry the burden of your environmental footprint. So over-reliance on offsetting is absolutely the wrong way to go about getting to net zero. And I could quote you a lot of case studies where that's been kind of proven to be the case, and specifically within the private sector, organisations have relied too heavily on offsetting and they've been bitten for it, and with good reason too. So offsetting should really only be used to get an organisation past the net zero finishing line, and never to keep an organisation in the race to net zero. That should fall to your own internal interventions. And again, it can be quite difficult to implement these interventions and to actually come up with them. And that harks back to our first principle, which is that you need to measure and understand what your carbon footprint actually looks like. I should say as well, here we have two net zero plans on this slide. One is very good, that's the one on the right, and one is the wrong way to do it, and that is with over-reliance on offsetting. The one that relies too heavily on offsetting is viewed as being a bit lazy. It might not hold up to scrutiny if anyone was to start asking questions about it, and it would potentially weaken your entire net zero plan. Whereas the one on the right shows proactive, you're actually trying to reduce your own emissions rather than just outsourcing those. And finally, it's very important to share what the things that we do that work, but also the things that we try that don't work. So we're all in this together. We're all trying to get to 2045. And that means we need each other's help. And that means we need to learn from each other's experiences, the successes that people or businesses experience, but also the mistakes that we make along the way. And I can say from personal experience that Zero Waste Scotland has made a lot of mistakes on our net zero journey. I could go into a bit of detail here, but I might get into trouble, so I better not. But things like we tried to replace our dairy milk, because we got milk delivered every week to the office, and then we tried to change that to oat milk. That was one of my initiatives designed. It was just a small part of our carbon footprint, but the backlash for that was pretty extreme. People, it seemed, didn't really like oat milk, so yeah, that one didn't fly. But it's still important to emphasize the point that if you try and implement these interventions, then you might upset some people, even if we are just talking about a change of milk. But making mistakes or taking wrong turns along the way is very important to share. I mean, successes are very important because, you know, that's good for business. It can highlight pioneering work that's been done. But it's just really important to be honest about things we've tried that haven't worked, that are just as important. And that's basically so that other organisations can look and they can see and they can avoid making those same mistakes, or they can adapt things that you've done so that they will in future possibly work. So just to sort of close out, I'd say, like, successes and failures, both of them need to be shouted from the rooftops, and that's to networks, to clients, and basically to everybody. Because this is going to get us to net zero all the faster. Because if Scotland is to make its 2045 obligations, then we're all going to have to work together across sectors, across all facets of industry. We all need to work together in order for us to cross the finishing line. So just in summary, every organisation needs to take responsibility for reducing and measuring its impacts, and in time producing a net zero plan. And that's just so we can meet our 2045 obligations. But having a net zero plan can also offer competitive advantage, especially if it is guided by our 5 key principles that, as I say, were developed very much in mind of organisations being able to replicate them and being universally applicable, I suppose. But Zero Waste Scotland is available to support organisations going on this journey, because it is tough, and some organisations that aren't particularly environmentally focused at the moment might find themselves under-resourced, or they might not really know where to begin. So as I say, a large part of my job is providing a bit of support in that regard. So I'm very happy to talk to anyone. I realise this has been quite a whistle-stop tour, but if anyone does want to get in touch after the conference or whenever suits, then I'll be very, very happy to help anyone that does reach out. So, and I'll just close by saying that thank you very much for having me today. Zero Waste Scotland have a web inquiry form on the website if anyone does have any questions that you want us to answer. It's already been used by a number of SMEs to quantify their carbon, advise on ways to go about net zero. And this is a part of my job I really enjoy. So if anyone wants to get in touch, then please feel free. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Fraser. That was really, really informative. I think you sort of given, I'm sure some of the people here, lots of food for thought, not least, how do they actually go about measuring their impact and working out what they need to do when they have competing funding priorities and they're maybe not set up to be environmental organisations. So I'm hoping that Julie, our next speaker from the Environmental Funders Network, might be able to provide a little bit of hope that there are solutions out there. Julie.
Sorry about that. Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me just go back to my original slide. Oh, it's not working. Previous. There we go. Great stuff. So thanks, Susan, for that introduction. I've been asked to talk about some sources of funding for environmental causes. So bear with me. I'm going to try and do my best in just about 10 minutes. Basically, I've been researching funding and securing grants for a wide range of charities and other third sector organisations for almost 25 years. Time flies when you're enjoying yourself. And the logos on this screen are from some of the organisations that I've been involved with in recent years. So I'm here today because I work 2 days a week as the Scotland coordinator for the Environmental Funders Network. EFN is a UK-based network of foundations and individual donors supporting environmental causes. There's not been a lot of environmental funding available in Scotland, and my role was created just last year to network and galvanise funders to do much more to support Scottish environmental work. In my spare time, I also volunteer as the treasurer of the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, and it's a relatively new Scottish charity, ERCS, working to strengthen environmental rights for every person in Scotland. And just a shameless plug, you're all warmly invited to our online launch and welcome event on the 3rd of June to find out more about our work. So I'm going to quickly cover what increasing numbers of funders are doing to address the climate emergency, so what they're doing themselves. So I would say, from EFN's point of view, all funders, whatever their charitable mission and or their field of expertise, all funders can play a part in addressing the causes of climate change and supporting adaptation to its effects. Indeed, there's a special responsibility on charitable funders whose assets are held for the public good to use their resources and independence to rise to this existential challenge. Don't often say that in a meeting. The number of funders that focus on environmental philanthropy has traditionally been very small. Encouragingly, EFN is seeing a surge in concern about environmental issues from funders. Last year, over 300 funders, representing 155 foundations and trusts, and more than 50 individual donors, joined EFN's online events. And 200 new funders and advisors joined our monthly mailing list. And that includes many who are new to environmental philanthropy. And that certainly gave us great hope in what was a really difficult year. So one of the things that EFN does is co-convene a group of over 100 funders working on the climate. And my colleague Patricia recently published a blog, which is available on our website, Where the Climate Grants Went 2020. That was based on data from 23 funders with annual budgets for climate-related work totaling at least £190 million collectively. Now that might sound like a lot. However, it's still really small relative to the urgency and scale of climate change. 60 funders, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. 60 funders have already signed something called the Funder Commitment on Climate Change, or FCCC, since it launched in November 2019. It's a voluntary public statement of intent for funders to commit to 6 actions, including to commit resources to accelerate work that addresses the causes and impacts of climate change, and which we've covered a little bit today, to steward their investments for a post-carbon future. The organisation looking after the funder commitment on climate change is called the Association of Charitable Foundations, and they've just recently, just last month, published a first progress report from some of the funders who've signed up. And that details a wealth of activity from simple changes to comprehensive strategies. So that report on what funders are doing is available on the ACF's website. One of the signatories to the Funder Commitment on Climate Change is the John Ellerman Foundation. They fund nationally important initiatives across 3 key areas: the environment, social action, and the arts. And for me, they summed this up really well recently. So they talked about the 5% that they spend each year in grants, and obviously that's important. However, they shouldn't ignore the 95%, which is their portfolio of investments, and the damage or otherwise that that's doing. So funders are looking both directions. We only look at them for the grants that they can give us, but actually they're looking behind the scenes at what their money's doing for them and for the planet. So which specific funders might fund your climate-related activity? In a very general sense, I would say absolutely any funder at all should and could fund climate change, because it cuts across everything. Climate change is a health issue, it's an equality issue, it's an educational issue, it's an economic issue, cultural, scientific, security, local communities, as well as an environmental issue. So you don't just need to go to environmental funders. And actually it would be better if you could widen the net and get non-environmental funders caring about this as well. So no matter what they fund, the climate is already having or will have an impact on what they fund. My suggestion is always to start with the funders that are already funding you or have funded you in the past, because they already know the value of your work. I would suggest, if they've got staff or if you know any of their trustees, get in touch and ask to have a climate conversation with them as an equal partner. As Fraser has said, we're all in this journey together. And if you can find out what they're doing or planning to do in this space and how you can help them achieve their objectives, and I think the more that funders hear from their grantees about climate-related concerns and solutions, the higher the priority they'll give. And that helps all of us. And while I'm on my soapbox, I'd like to make a special plea to always apply for unrestricted funding when it's made available, as that gives you the greatest flexibility to use their grant in the best possible way. But also it reinforces how important it is for the whole sector to have access to more unrestricted funding. And that's one of the benefits that COVID has taught funders, is that they need to increase the flexibility around what they fund us to do. So I'm going to move on and look at some of there are 4 Scottish funders who have signed the funder commitment on climate change so far. Others have said to me in my EFN role that it's not a case of if they'll sign, but when they'll sign. So they're already looking at signing up to it, which is fantastic. So as I said, it's a voluntary commitment though. So Catanach is a funder for early years work in Scotland, awarding grants of around 600,000 in new funds, each year. Catanach's director, Sophie Fleming, was on the board of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland last year, and is probably part of the driving force for getting them to be an early adopter and sign up to the FCCC. The world's biggest philanthropic funder, which is CIF, the Children's Investment Foundation Fund, I think it is, they say that climate change poses the single biggest threat to the future of today's children. So any funder looking at early years and what children concerned about. I was talking just the other week to somebody from BBC Children in Need in Scotland, and they were saying climate anxiety amongst young people is really something that they want to try and tackle. The second one next to Catanac is Foundation Scotland. They distributed nearly £22 million through 94 different funds to nearly 2,500 organisations in the last 12 months. And many of the local funds that they manage are distributing community benefit funds from renewable energy. So I'm just going to mention a couple of them. Vattenfall, Unlock Our Futures Fund, that's made possible from the Aberdeen offshore wind farm. It prioritises projects that actively contribute to what they call a climate smart future. And in the Scottish Borders, where I grew up, the EDF Long Park Wind Farm Community Fund, which is a hell of a long name, they're funding Stow Community Trust to let local residents try out electric bikes for several weeks at a time, in the hope that people will feel confident enough to swap their car for a bike on local journeys. And I think that's a fabulous initiative. Foundation Scotland is also the first community foundation in the UK to launch an impact investment strategy. So if we hark back to Julie's presentation, impact was at the very far end under the sea of what to do. And that's about achieving social and environmental good as well as a financial return through their investments. The Pebble Trust is a fantastic wee grant-making charity covering the Highlands and Islands. They typically give small grants up to 5,000 to support projects which contribute to what they say is a more sustainable and just society. So again, just a wee example, they co-funded a series of Highland Good Food conversations about how to get more local sustainable food onto people's dinner plates. Cora Foundation, which used to be the Lloyds TSB Foundation for Scotland, they've set up a staff working group which they call the Green Team, and they're looking to integrate climate change considerations within all their existing programmes, their priorities and their processes, and that includes the Scottish Government money that they manage, which is awarded overseas. So they've got the Climate Justice Innovation Fund and other kind of developmental small grants, mainly for work in Malawi, Rwanda, Zambia and Pakistan. So there are obviously, these are just 4, there are obviously many, many more. I did a quick search on Funding Scotland earlier on today, put the word climate in and it came up with 47. But I just want to head towards the end of the talk looking at these 3. So Garfield Weston Foundation is the UK's second largest independent funder. They have over £12 billion in assets. It funds across the UK and in 2019-20 gave out £88 million in over 2,000 grants. In Scotland, that was 175 grants worth over £3.5 million. So they fund across a whole range of different headings and the environment is one. And within that, tackling climate change is a key priority. The trustees do want to receive more applications, particularly for practical projects. So for example, retrofitting community buildings to improve their energy efficiency. Also educational projects, volunteering and things like that. People's Postcode Trust provides funding of up to £20,000 to smaller charities and up to £2,000 if you're not a charity but still in the third sector. They fund across Scotland, and again they have a number of themes, and one of them is responding to the climate emergency and promoting sustainability. And Scotland's largest independent funder, the Robertson Trust, briefly had a note about climate helping adapt to climate change on their website. When I looked at it again today, I couldn't find it. So I've got a question mark over what they're willing or what they might consider funding. But again, if you're already getting funding from the Robertson Trust or any of the other ones I've talked about, get in touch with them and say, look, these are the kinds of things we're needing funding for. Can we come to you for that? So finally, I just wanted to leave you with some other additional resources that you might find useful. So as trustees, the oversight of fundraising is one of your key duties. So you don't need to necessarily be an expert in fundraising, but you need to know how fundraising is done for your charity. And you need to make sure that your charity complies with all relevant laws and things like that, but also doesn't put its reputation at risk. So I'll give you an example. A charity, I was looking at their website the other day, and they are quite clear that they've accepted money for the last 10 years from ExxonMobil. Now, within EFN, I know that that would get the hackles up on a number of trusts who really care passionately about the environment and wouldn't therefore consider funding them. So you need to be aware of your actions and what it looks like to other people, whether they're donors, funders, you're just anybody that's interested in your work, really. So one of the things that the Chartered Institute Fundraising produced last year was an environmental change toolkit for fundraisers to look at building environmental considerations into all aspects of how charities and other organisations raise funds, including applying to trusts. So I definitely recommend you have a look at that. If you're looking to decarbonise your own operations, which Fraser has obviously gone over and is a great resource, I'd also just point out that Scottish Environment Link has been carbon accounting and publishing their carbon accounts for the last 11 years, and that's all available on their website. Really interesting example of an early adopter. And on Cora Foundation's website, there was information about how much money how much carbon dioxide they saved through recycling in the last year or so. So a couple more things that I don't think should cost you any money, just possibly some staff and trustee time, but will show that you're really serious about this. One of the things is looking at where you bank your money. In the 5 years since the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 biggest banks have financed fossil fuels to the tune of £3.8 trillion. So my challenge to you, and as a treasurer for a charity, I'm looking at this as well, can you find a more ethical bank or credit union for your organisation? And also looking at your pension provider and what's their policy and practice regarding climate and investing your employees' money for their retirement. So I recently found out that Friends of the Earth Scotland, for example, use Nest. And I looked on Nest's website and they've got a climate aware fund, but they also talk about building climate considerations across all of their portfolio. So that's just an example. I'm not giving you financial or otherwise advice. And the last thing, just really, if you're struggling to know how to talk to people about climate, there's a great toolkit called Britain Talks Climate that really segments people into a whole range of different groups and stresses what's important to them and where you can find common ground, because a lot of people do find this quite a difficult subject to talk about. So that's it from me. I'm happy to try and answer any questions or post some links in the chat if that would be helpful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was absolutely fascinating, and I would say quite reassuring, actually. So there have been a few questions in the Q&A that both Julie and Fraser, that were directed at Julie and Fraser, and they've answered. So I'm going to kick off, because we've only got 10 minutes, or maybe finish up really with a question about how scared should organisations be about climate change? Go on, Julie.
So I live and work in the East End of Glasgow, and just the other day I was looking at the Climate Ready Action Plan. I think it's words to that effect, and it's really, really terrifying to look at what is going to happen in terms of flooding, people's health, buildings overheating like hospitals and things like that. It's scary.
And does that, sorry, just quickly, does that then outline a little bit about the impact on poorer communities in that area? What impact there could be on poorer communities?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just as another example, along the banks of the Clyde, you've got Clyde Bank. You know that in the next 50 years, that's not even going to exist anymore with water rising and.
Yeah. And what about being scared about actually making the transition to net zero? Because I know that that's something that really terrifies people. How on earth are they going to have to cut back on their cars and their holidays and their steaks? Fraser, do you think voluntary organisations themselves should be scared about how they make the transition? And and how they support communities to make that transition?
I mean, it's obviously, because net zero is quite a new concept, you can't expect organisations to really hit the ground running. There is going to be an adjustment period where they have to sort of get to grips with, okay, we have until 2045, but ideally long before that to hit net zero. So yes, organisations should have a healthy fear, because if we don't meet our climate obligations, then, as Julie says, the climate, the effects of that are going to be absolutely devastating. But it's probably more of an onus on third sector charitable organisations, because some of the people that are regularly interact with are probably potentially less in tune with the climate agenda, and you know that there might be a bridge to gap there. So it's, yeah, it's going to be an interesting time going forward, absolutely. But that's why showing leadership early on is a really important thing to do, and just to sort of try and work with specialists. I'm going to plug Zero Waste Scotland here, just to sort of to tackle it. It is going to be very difficult, and it shouldn't be done in isolation. We all need to work together, and that's a lot. Like I say, it's a huge part of my job. Really love doing it, and yeah, it's going to be much harder if the charitable sector works in isolation. But if they can draw on expertise from other areas of industry, then yeah, we can all get there quicker and in a more inclusive manner.
Julie, do you have something to add? Julie Hutchinson, that is, about organisational fear, either about climate change or actually making that move?
I think, you know, it's one of the areas, if I think about what I've seen with charities that are the early adopters and making change to their investments. I mean, obviously not every charity has investments, that's the starting point, but for those that do, those are the ones that I tend to see just through the work in my day job. And it's undoubtedly the case that young person-focused organisations are the ones that have been the earliest actors on this, in terms of either excluding certain things from their portfolio or deliberately tilting towards climate solutions in the way they invest. But the other one, I think that we will start to perhaps see more action on, is health, because you can start to make connections with air pollution. And while, you know, we might be familiar with the concept of excess winter deaths, even in the time pre-COVID, with flu taking its toll on the health of the population, excess summer deaths, I think, is going to be a phrase that is already beginning to be used in the NHS, where again, vulnerable adults who are less able to survive extremes or deal with these changes, especially in respiratory illnesses, excess summer heat is a real health issue. And so when trustees are struggling to think, well, actually, how does climate change affect our charity? How does it affect our beneficiaries? There's actually a bit of an education piece needed, I think, to try and help accelerate trustees in their confidence in being able to make these connections and therefore take the action that they might need to take from an investment perspective.
Yeah, and so that's certainly, again, why we're having this webinar and other webinars that are aimed at staff, to try and get the sector starting to talk about this and starting to think through these implications. So we've also had a question which is a bit different, about how charities can get involved in COP26. And I'm not sure if you as a panel can answer that, but you can maybe tell us how you're getting involved. But Julie Christie does seem to have an answer.
Well, two things very briefly. As far as I understand it, the deadline for doing an official event at COP26 passed in, I think it was April. It might have even been as far back as March. However, there is a huge amount of already going on in the run up to COP26. And if you have a look at, I think it's Stop Climate Chaos Scotland's Climate Fringe website, you'll see so many organisations, so many events. And obviously, if you're running an event, post it on there, get people along. I would suggest that the best time to do events are either in the run up to or after, because it's going to be such a busy, packed fortnight when COP26 itself is actually on. One of the key things is to try and sustain people's enthusiasm and engagement and willingness to change after COP26 is finished. So that's maybe a best time to really kind of ramp up and see what your organisation can do.
I'll second Julie's point about the climate fringe. There's already loads of information on that website. And in fact, I advertised this webinar on that Climate Fringe website. So there's activities going on all the way up to COP26. And I, from an SCVO point of view as well, and probably Fraser would agree with me on that, that COP26 is almost a bit of a red herring. We want to see it as an opportunity to get everybody talking, but the real action that has to happen is beyond COP26, certainly for us. Obviously, at a government level, it's a very important meeting. But for us in the third sector, or the voluntary sector, really we need to start taking action beyond COP26. Would you agree, Fraser?
Yeah, COP26 will get everyone to the table, but it's what happens after it as a fallout of COP26 that will make most difference, because the way we're headed at the moment, we're still going to be in a fair bit of trouble in terms of climate emergency. So the decisions made at COP26 should give us real direction about what happens next. Yes, we are going on a net zero journey, but does that need to be tightened up? Does it need to include more of our, so we've got two types of emissions. We've got our emissions from Scotland, but also our worldwide carbon footprint. So an example, like, does our net zero plan need to have greater accountability for our worldwide carbon footprint than it does currently? There are unanswered questions that COP might give a bit of direction to, but it's very much what happens after COP that will determine if we are successful in tackling the climate emergency. Absolutely, yeah.
And just to say as well, if you're an organisation, if you think your organisation is actually doing really well in this area and you think you would be a good case study for events around COP26, then do get in touch with SCVO. We are likely to be organising some sort of events in the Fringe or other venues highlighting good practice. And we've also just launched the Climate Conscious Charity Award. So if your organisation is a climate conscious charity, then please get your application in for the Climate Conscious Charity Award. But we have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to hand back over to Julie Hutchison to give us some sort of final comments before we finish up.
Great. Well, I think the polls that we've had have just been really good to reflect on in terms of, okay, we know where we are now. It's now about supporting that conversation, and there's been so many brilliant resources shared today. I think there's a blog crying out to be written. And so it's about getting that conversation going, getting it on the agenda at board meetings, and viewing this in tandem with recovering out of beyond COVID. The two things go hand in hand.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Julie, Christie, Fraser, do you have any final remarks? I think that's, oh, Fraser, sorry.
Yeah, just very quickly to say that we are all at the start of net zero, so it's quite a daunting prospect to try and get from where we are currently to a place where we can say, we are a net zero organisation. But there's a lot of opportunities out there as well to show leadership, and there's a lot of co-benefits as well. If you can get a good name by taking net zero seriously, then it can have benefits outside of the environmental context. So I would encourage anyone again to get in touch that has any element of net zero they're struggling with, or even want more advice. Then I am very happy to talk to anyone on that. I did forget to put my email address in my final slide, so apologies for that. I think I did add it to the Q&A section though, if anyone does want to get in touch.
Great. And if anybody has any further questions for any of the panelists, they can email SCVO and we'll pass them on if you haven't got direct contact for the panelists. Julie, Christie, do you have a final point?
Yeah, just to say that funders are part of the third sector, and a lot of them are on this journey as well. And the Scotland Funders Forum had a climate focused meeting in December. Scottish Grant Makers, which attend those meetings, and they're talking about it. There's lots of discussion. It's about putting things into action and not waiting. Don't wait too long to do this. Get on the front foot. So, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And as Julie Christie said earlier, if funders are getting pressure from organisations themselves, that will also push them to take action on this. Thank you very much to all our panelists, and to Aberdeen Standard Capital for supporting the Trustees Network. And I think that's the end for us. Like I said, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and check out the SCVO website for any future events in this area. Thank you very much.